From a headquarters standpoint, the North American aviation operation had been handled in a somewhat haphazard and disorganized fashion because no single well-defined channel of communication and command existed between Washington and the field. While this was perhaps inevitable in an unprecedented situation where policy questions required War Department and government leaders to participate directly in supervising the operation, it was a condition that merited correction. An effort had been made by the Labor Section, OUSW, to pull the various aspects of the operation together and to channel all communications through its office, an effort aided by the fact that most of the important non-technical questions were of a labor character. In any event, this experience demonstrated the desirability of centralizing, since it was felt that the North American aviation case may have been atypical and that legal, fiscal, procurement, production, and other technical problems, rather than labor issues, might predominate in future cases where management cooperation was not present. The Labor Section concluded that this responsibility should be placed in a newly formed unit that might also undertake War Department duties under the requisition law, then in the process of congressional enactment. The Labor Section presented its views to Undersecretary Patterson. At his request, prepared several studies on the subject. The matter was pushed vigorously because after the North American in the aviation case, two other situations developed where the possibility of government, the seizure, appeared real. In one of these situations, management cooperation appeared unlikely. In addition, in August 1941, the Navy Department suddenly found itself operating the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company as a result of that firm's refusal to accept recommendations of the National Defense Mediation Board, NDMB. The Navy was encountering many difficulties that the War Department, fortunately, had escaped at North American Aviation. Although the suggestion to centralize all seizure operations in one office was repeatedly advanced during subsequent months and at later stages of the war, the idea was unfortunately never adopted. The Federal Shipbuilding case stimulated further consideration of the general subject of plant seizures, since it presented the first World War II instance of management defiance, similar to that of the 1918 Smith & Wesson Company case. Because of the War Department's experience at North American Aviation, the Navy naturally turned to it for advice. Much of the early thinking on the non-labor aspects of the Federal Shipbuilding case were joint products of the two services. This was fortunate because within 2 months, the War Department was deeply involved in a comparable situation at Air Associates. The case also furnished the occasion for certain additional theoretical considerations of the nature and objectives of any plant seizure. The case of Air Associates, Inc. was comparable to the North American aviation seizure only in its dramatic beginning. It was infinitely more complex than its predecessor because of the impossibility of retaining the company's top operating personnel, and because the business was in serious financial difficulties. The case represented the first instance in the World War II period where the War Department seized an industrial facility because of a strike that resulted directly from a company's refusal to accept the recommendations of a government agency. In this case, the NDMB. While Air Associates was in many respects entirely unique in the history of plant seizures, it raised new issues and required the disposition of a large number of important problems that recurred elsewhere. Description of the company. Air Associates was a small company employing less than 1,000 persons at its principal plant in Bendix, New Jersey, and at 7 branch establishments located in Lodi and Belleville, New Jersey, Chicago and Rockford, Illinois, Dallas, Texas, Marshall, Missouri, and Los Angeles, California. The latter were assembly points, warehouses, and distribution centers. Before the wartime emergency, it had been an unimportant jobbing house dealing in small but standard manufactured aircraft parts. As the aircraft program got underway, however, its business mushroomed, and it contracted for additional manufacturing operations. Orders flowed in at a rapidly increasing rate, and the company accepted them beyond its probable ability to deliver. By the fall of 1941, 30% of its total backlog was represented by some 40 prime contracts with the Army Air Forces, AAF, with an aggregate value of approximately $1,445,000. It also had substantial Navy contracts, with the balance of its business consisting of orders from several major aircraft companies. The company was owned by the 10 men who constituted its board of directors. 6 of these had other more important business or professional interests and knew little about the operation of the enterprise. To them, it was a sideshow to which they gave little attention. The other 4 were Leroy Hill, its president, a strong-minded individual who personally ran the business and established its policies. General Development's Air Associates case. Seizure, H.I. Crow, the executive vice president, and G.S. Cleverstrom, the secretary-treasurer, both Hill supporters, and Roy Aker, who handled operations on the West Coast and apparently was not on the best of terms with Hill. The company had been experiencing financial difficulties, largely because its working capital, sufficient for its volume of business in 1939, was insufficient for purposes of its greatly expanded 1941 operations. An effort to refinance through floating an issue of preferred stock had failed, and the company had been forced to borrow increasingly large amounts. Background of the dispute. In July 1941, the CIO-affiliated United Automobile Workers of America, UAW, had been certified as the exclusive bargaining agent at Air Associates after a close election in which a large minority of the employees voted in favor of no union. The company immediately laid off certain UAW members, ostensibly because of a lack of materials. The CIO construed this action as anti-union and called a strike. The dispute was certified to the NDMB, and the men returned to work. For the next 2 months, the board endeavored unsuccessfully to resolve the dispute while also undertaking the more basic problem of assisting the parties in negotiating their first collective bargaining agreement. The company, on the rare occasions when its representatives appeared at scheduled board meetings, objected to the reinstatement of the affected men and to the negotiation of an agreement, repeatedly challenging the National Labor Relations Board's certification of the UAW. These delays and other further acts on the part of the company brought about a new strike early in October, at a time when Professor Harry Schulman of Yale, the university, at the request of the NOMB, was undertaking an independent investigation of the case. When company officials walked out of a conference searching for a way to end this new strike, the NDMB recommended on 9th October 1941 that the union call off the strike, that the company immediately return all strikers to their former jobs without discrimination, and that the parties attend a further hearing before the NOMB in order to work out a general collective bargaining contract. These were standard NOMB recommendations in every case where a strike was in progress, which had received almost universal acceptance in prior disputes. The union promptly accepted, but the company, while agreeing to re-employ the strikers, stated that it would only do so over a period of 30 days and then without any guarantee that the persons concerned would be restored to their former jobs. The board construed this conditional acceptance as a rejection and announced that it was turning the entire case over to the executive branch for action. War Department efforts to forestall a crisis. Paralleling these unfavorable developments were material deteriorations in both production and financial situations at the plant. The company became 130 to 150 days delinquent in its deliveries to the Army. AAF representatives repeatedly met with the company's president and threatened to terminate Army contracts unless the situation was promptly improved, and the possibility of shifting these orders elsewhere was carefully explored. Early in October, conditions became so serious that War Department representatives attended a board of directors meeting and demanded a change in management based on the grounds that delivery were delinquent, financial conditions were critical, and management's continuing labor relations difficulties threatened Army procurement. Representatives of the Undersecretary of War also made repeated appeals to the President and directors for compliance with the NDMB's recommendations, stating that failure to do so would result in the termination of Army contracts. Development of the final labor crisis. Almost simultaneously with the NDMB's announced referral of the case to higher authority, the Army Air Forces came to the unexpected conclusion that it could not transfer its orders elsewhere within any short period, and that many aircraft concerns would have difficulty obtaining parts if the Bendix plant shut down. This eliminated the possibility of permitting the strike to run its course. The government was face to face with the necessity of taking more drastic steps. Hopeful that a direct appeal to the owners might avert a takeover, the entire board of directors was asked to meet with William S. Knudsen and Undersecretary Patterson on the 24th of October. This meeting took place when the situation at the plant gave every indication of reaching a bloody crisis, with mass picketing in progress and large groups of militant non-union employees staging demonstrations and endeavoring to break into the plant. After many hours of haggling, the company agreed that all employees on strike will be returned to the payroll at their former pay on Monday, October 2nd, and will be placed in their former positions as fast as possible. This announcement postponed the crisis, and the plant operated without pickets the following day. When the strikers presented themselves for reinstatement, the company offered to place them on the payroll with pay on the basis of standard workweek until a specific job was found. This precluded any possibility of these men receiving overtime earnings, which normally constituted a very large portion of take-home pay at this plant. Furthermore, there was no assurance when, if ever, employees would be placed in their former jobs. The union immediately threatened to restore the picket lines, and over the next 2 days, the situation quickly deteriorated. At a hurriedly convened conference on 29 October, it was decided that a representative of the War Department should be sent to the plant to physically supervise the reinstatement in specific jobs of the persons who had been out on strike, even though that meant displacing replacement workers. On the morning of 30th October, Colonel Roy N. Jones, chief of the AAF's Eastern Procurement District, and his assistant, Major Peter Beasley, proceeded to Bendix. They found an almost hopeless situation. A large number of non-striking employees, wearing the badge of the Air Associates Benevolent Association, were on site protesting the return of the strikers. It was evident that there would be trouble. And as soon as striking employees began to return to their former jobs under Army supervision, the other employees struck. After one returning striker had been injured in a scuffle, the CIO representative withdrew all his men. Conditions were so bad that Beasley and Jones felt it inadvisable to address the workers in the plant in an attempt to restore some semblance of order. These events were repeated at the beginning of the night shift, and the picket line had been re-established. New and more serious trouble appeared to be in the office. As the picket line grew, reports came in that sympathy strikes were occurring at neighboring plants, and that sympathizers were mobilizing in great force to march on Bendix. By 8:15 p.m., the county sheriff, who had placed 20 policemen around the properties, advised Jones that the crowd would soon be out of his control. At 9:15, after picketers had set fire to the grass adjacent to the plant, burning down several small buildings, the sheriff called the governor for assistance, stating he could no longer assume responsibility for the safety of the non-union members in the plant, who were now conducting a sit-down strike. Word came that the crowd was planning to forcibly invade the plant and throw out its occupants. County police mounted machine guns on the roof of the building and issued sawed-off shotguns and pistols to recently employed workers. According to Colonel Jones, The police were wholly out of sympathy with the CIO, and there is little doubt that had the strikers continued to carry out their threats, there would have been a massacre, the proportions of which would have been terrible to contemplate. Colonel Jones, having concluded that people were about to be killed and government property destroyed, directed that the plant be shut down and asked the sheriff to smuggle the non-union employees out of the plant through a back entrance and transport them in unlighted cars across a meadow to safety. This was accomplished at the same time that a skirmish line CIO members could be seen advancing on the plant. Fortunately, this movement was stopped by their leaders, and the group, having learned of the departure of the non-union employees from the plant or of developments in Washington, became less menacing and undertook to organize what they termed a victory parade. Jones and Beasley continued a lonely vigil in the plant, awaiting further instructions. The decision to take over. Special Consultant McGrady foresaw these events and advised Undersecretary Patterson on 28 October that seizure of the facilities was the only satisfactory answer from the government's standpoint and from that of the public, the employees, and Air Associates management. He reasoned that seizure and operation of the plant would enable the War Department to utilize the facilities of this plant for the production of items needed by the War Department and by War Department prime contractors, and would at the same time enable us to uphold the mediation board and reestablish collective bargaining and satisfactory labor relations. By the afternoon of 30 October, no one questioned this view, particularly after the UAW's Richard Frankenstein had advised President Roosevelt that riots would occur unless the government immediately intervened. Jones and Beasley continued to plead for such action. All day, officials in the War Department, the Department of Justice, and the NDMB worked on the preparation of papers. At 9:30 p.m., Undersecretary Patterson recommended seizure to the president, and at 10:15, an executive order was signed. Roosevelt simultaneously issued a statement castigating the company for its failure to accept the NDMB's recommendations and calling for an immediate return to work. At 2 a.m., on the 3rd October, Colonel Jones announced that he had taken possession of the plant as the War Department representative, with Major Beasley serving as his deputy. By this time, a staff of technical assistants, including McGrady, Major Beasley, Carl R. Bendetson, a judge advocate, Lieutenant Donald Ibsen, a labor officer, and Major Robert S. Pickens, a public relations advisor, were route by plane, and several thousand troops were moving to the plant. Before dawn, notices of government possession had been posted, and some 2,000 soldiers were deployed. Problems confronting the Army. Unlike at North American Aviation, the task of obtaining a prompt return to the work did not appear to be overly difficult. While fights the preceding afternoon between reinstated strikers and non-strikers indicated the existence of strong feelings between the two groups, there was reason to believe that the presence of federal troops would prevent any repetition of violence. On the other hand, the problem of working out a permanent solution of the conditions that precipitated the seizure loomed very large. Hill, his immediate associates, and the company's attorney, Mr. Chelair, seemed determined to prevent compliance with the NMB's recommendations or settlement of other points with the union. Even before government intervention, the only solution seemed to lie in obtaining new management and having this new group negotiate a collective bargaining agreement with the certified union under the direction of the NOMB. Since the directors at the preceding week's Washington conference had supported Hill and his labor policies, it was determined that such a solution might take a long time to work out, and in the meantime, the plant had to be run, probably without management cooperation. This raised a series of business problems that had been absent at North American Aviation, and that were complicated by the company's financial situation. Colonel Jones' instructions, almost identical to those of Colonel Branshaw, did not provide ready-made answers. Restoring production, Since most of the employees had not slept during the preceding turbulent night, Jones decided to postpone manufacturing operations until the middle of the day and to use the intervening hours to prepare for a full restoration of production. Plannel. At 8 a.m., he addressed a large number of employees assembled at the plant. He informed them that he was speaking in the president's name, that he had taken possession of the plant and would operate it for the United States. That's all former employees should return to their jobs, and that each person would be placed in his former position on an individual basis and without discrimination as soon as certain details could be worked out. 15. This appeal was supplemented by a radio broadcast in which Jones and McGrady told of the purpose of the seizure and the status of the plant, and by telephone calls to employees informing them of the reopening. During the morning, office workers were admitted and hired to carry on in their normal positions. A RAP survey was made of plant conditions, and preliminary plans were developed for the control of operations, for the recording of all business transactions, and for an inventory. At noon, Jones began to admit employees in groups of 5. Each employee was interviewed, required to sign an employment application, and assigned as far as possible to his former position. By the end of the day shift, more than 60% of the production force was at work, and some shipments of materials had been made to meet critical shortages. By the following afternoon, production and the workforce had returned to normal. The one real obstacle to keeping the workforce intact was the strong feelings of persons in the non-union group, but any real danger of an incident or of a walkout seemed remote. A petition signed by 502 employees, alleging that the pre-seizure disorders were entirely the work of a small minority of strikers and outside agitators, requested that the United States immediately withdraw from possession so that the former loyal American management of the company might continue to operate the plant. Investigation disclosed that this petition had been written by a publicity man for Hill. 17. Colonel Jones and other War Department officials believed that Hill was trying to inflame worker conflicts, and Jones decided to exclude him, Crow, and Chalair from the plant and keep 300 soldiers on guard duty as late as December 3rd. Immediate operating problems. Colonel Jones called a directors' meeting early on the first morning of the seizure. This meeting was friendly, and company representatives agreed to cooperate fully with the government. Jones and Beasley were willing to test this pledge, but as realists, they nevertheless went about the job of making plans for direct government operation. They faced several types of difficulties, including practical questions concerned with the taking of an inventory, the establishment of an accounting system, the development of procurement procedures, and the financing of the enterprise with government funds. Problems relating to the proportion of the company's total business the War Department would endeavor to carry on. Problems created by the company's prior production and planning decisions, and problems growing out of the company's financial condition. All these dilemmas were interwoven with and had to be solved in the light of the ultimate task of developing a permanent solution permitting the early return of the plant to private ownership. By 9 o'clock on the first morning of occupation, an inventory was underway, a difficult job because the plant contained hundreds of thousands of small items of the kind to be found in any jobbing house. Because a physical count could require weeks of extensive labor, which could interrupt or delay operations, an innovative procedure was adopted. The closing balance sheet of the company, as 30 September 1941, the end of its fiscal year, and the record of all shipments received and made during the subsequent 30 days were obtained and combined, providing a satisfactory estimate of the value of the properties taken. This work was turned over to a New York accounting firm engaged on the morning of the seizure under a contract that also provided for a complete audit of the company's books and the opening of a new set of books to reflect department operation. The Army Air Force's immediate furnished finance officers to Colonel Jones, and AAF funds were credited to his account. It was recognized that he would have to make expenditures that might not be approved by the General Accounting Office, GAO, and that in such event, special legislation to reimburse him would be necessary. Fortunately, many of these problems were largely avoided by converting the operation into one that was essentially for the account of the company, free, and the final cost to the government was only $8,008.23. As the company initially indicated no desire to continue its normal procurement, Major Beasley was designated as contracting officer with instructions to purchase materials through the channels ordinarily used by Air Associates, but for the account of the government. The War Department continued both the commercial and military work of the company because the character of the business was such as to make segregation of the two types of transactions very difficult. Most of the commercial business was indirectly for defense purposes, and it seemed undesirable to destroy a going enterprise and its goodwill, particularly if there was any hope that the plant could be restored to private control. A more fundamental question related to whether the War Department would extend its control to the company's 7 branches nationwide, for which the Bendix plant was the central office and control point for sales, purchases, and records. It was the consensus that from a business standpoint, this integrated system should be operated as a unit. This view was strengthened by a belief that control over these additional properties strengthened the War Department's bargaining position with management. As matters stood, certain members of management believed that they could use this situation to embarrass the War Department, and there was some indication that they might be planning to set up a new central operating unit, comparable to the Bendix plant, that would service and tie in with the branch establishments. Failure to take over these branches might also lead to a company charge that the War Department had destroyed their business by failing to supply them with goods. The decision was made to supply these branches irrespective of War Department control. This produced a number of accounting and bookkeeping problems. The company was quick to raise the question of control of the branches in a letter to Secretary Stimson that unwittingly argued the best possible case for extension of government possession. It pointed out that the Bendix plant controlled all branch operations, filled more than 100 branch requisitions for materials daily, carried on the entire company's accounting and bookkeeping work, made funds available for local branch payrolls, and performed all engineering, designing, and experimental work necessary to meet the requirements of branch office customers. In addition, one half of its manufacturing was in response to orders received from these branches. The letter demanded an arrangement under which the company could continue to use the facilities of the Bendix plant. The War Department came to a prompt decision, but Judge Advocate General Major General Myron C. Kramer was doubtful whether the executive order was sufficiently broad to permit the taking of these properties. After conferring with President Roosevelt, however, Secretary Stimson moved forward with the plan to seize the remaining facilities. Taking the other properties presented a practical organizational problem that was solved by issuing new instructions to Colonel Jones and by issuing separate instructions to AAF officers located near the branch properties, ordering them to seize and operate each under Jones' direction and control. The additional properties were in the possession of these officers by the afternoon of 7th November, and arrangements were immediately made through a New York accounting firm and the accounting offices of the appropriate procurement districts to take an inventory and to handle other financial details. These properties had no labor problems, and operation of them caused no difficulty. A third question concerned whether new construction work under a Defense the Plant Corporation lease with Air Associates should be continued. Since the new facilities adjacent to the Bendix plant were for defense purposes, and because of the adoption of the policy of not disrupting the company's normal business, the War Department decided that this work should go forward. Major Beasley stated that he found the plant in a worse condition than any other plant he had ever seen, with 43% of the machinery blacked out, because of lack of direction and 63% of the work requiring redoing. The firm's delinquencies on orders were already well known. Accordingly, Jones was authorized to make any changes in the plant and to purchase any machinery he felt would be desirable in the interests of full and efficient production. The job to be done was largely of an engineering character, and Beasley, who was an old hand at this sort of thing, methodically reorganized the plant. By the end of the war, department possession 8 weeks later, production was approximately 30% higher, and sales had increased. During the second month of government operation, the net income of the business exceeded that of any previous month in the company's history. The company's lack of adequate capital was quickly apparent. Its pre-war annual sales of about $1.8 million quadrupled in 1941. Capital adequate for its 1939 business was not adequate to meet the fourfold increase. When the attempt to float stock failed, the company resorted to bank loans obtained from the Irving Trust Company and Bank of Manhattan. The company was short of cash, and the War Department, by operating its business, was cutting off its principal source of income. Since the bank loans were made against accounts receivable, the banks immediately wished to know government intentions with respect to remittances in payment of such accounts. They were advised that the government had no interest in any current accounts receivable, nor in any remittances received in payment of shipments made prior to government possession, but that remittances reflecting payment for shipments made during or as a result of government operations would, to the extent that they reflected government effort, be covered by the Treasury of the United States. The banks were also concerned over the possibility that trade creditors with delinquent accounts might precipitate insolvency proceedings, and with this in mind, they declared their intention of calling in outstanding loans and offsetting deposits of the company against them. War Department representatives took the position that this decision was up to the banks, but suggested that no other single action would precipitate insolvency proceedings more quickly, ending any possibility of government aid through advance payments on outstanding company contracts. The banks were impressed by these arguments. The financial situation provided the key to the discovery of a technique for operation without the use of government funds, while simultaneously serving as a powerful weapon in forcing a solution of the case. Method of operation. Since Hill and his associates were excluded from the premises, there seemed no alternative except to operate the plants with government funds and managing personnel. For all the reasons foreseen, direct government operation immediately gave every evidence of proving unsatisfactory. There would be difficulties in carrying out day-to-day procurement in accordance with Army regulations, including deductions and payments of Social Security and related taxes and benefits, in reconciling private employment practices with civil service rules, or, conversely, in applying civil service rules to employees, in employing salesmen and sales engineers to maintain the company's commercial business and goodwill, and in making the kind of expenditures required to run a private enterprise consistent with GAO procedures. The formation of a government corporation similar to the National Operating Corporation of World War I was therefore considered. Attorneys Joseph Bishop and Arthur F. Tripp, Jr. prepared a study of the steps necessary for creating such a corporation, its advantages, and its method of operation. With the exception of Colonel Greenbaum, everyone was of the opinion that if no other arrangement could be worked out quickly, either for the return of the properties to heir associates or for some operating arrangement that would end the need for using federal funds, the general procedure urged in the Bishop and Tripp report should be adopted. The necessity for such action was eliminated on 22 November. After 3 weeks of negotiations, a unique arrangement between the company, its creditors, and the War and Navy departments were effected, making it possible to operate the properties without further use of federal funds and to reimburse the government for all expenditures. The agreement served as a means of providing working capital for the business until equity funds could be obtained. Under the agreement, special accounts were established, to which the banks that had extended credit to Air Associates transferred all monies from the company's regular accounts. The banks agreed to extend their loans at 4% instead of the former 2.5% interest. The War and Navy departments agreed to make advance payments for deposit in these special accounts in the amount of 30% of their outstanding contracts with the company, approximately $500,000. And the company agreed that all its future receipts, with the exception of small accounts required locally for the operation of branch establishments, would be similarly deposited. The amounts in the special accounts might be used for any business purpose, including the reimbursement of the government for all expenses incurred by it in operating the properties, but not including the cost of troops and other strictly seizure expenses, until all advance payments deposited in such accounts had been liquidated. Any withdrawals were subject to the approval of the War Department representative, and extensive security provisions were included to protect creditors. Most important, the contract contained a promise by the company to obtain a new president or general manager as soon as possible at the War Department's option. Within 21 days, it was expected that Gov-Age advances would be liquidated as contracts were performed, and that sufficient working capital would be provided until the company could be refinanced. This agreement was doubly significant from a War Department standpoint because it meant that future expenses would be paid out of company rather than government funds, and that prior federal expenditures in running the business would be reimbursed. The complicating factor of government financing was now out of the picture, and any need for creating a government operating corporation was gone. Finding a permanent solution, Colonel Jones and his associates were convinced that new management was needed to permanently solve the troubles at Air Associates, and they sought to persuade company directors of the need for this move. Irrespective of the very persuasive fact of government possession, this might have proved very difficult if the company had been solvent, or if the War Department had indicated a willingness to relinquish control with the former management in place. In spite of initial assurances of cooperation, it was plain that the faction represented by Hill maintained a running fight against the War Department, both privately and in the press. And the Air Associates Board, in its November 5 meeting, supported Hill and his lieutenants, even though it concluded that too much policy discretion had been vested in. In the succeeding days, 4 of the directors visited the plant and talked to Colonel Jones. For the first time, they learned of the circumstances leading up to the government's action, and they expressed shock and surprise. They were further advised of the War Department's determination to remain until acceptable managerial personnel were substituted for Hill, and later of the dependency of the proposed financial agreement upon a promise to this effect. By the middle of the month, the majority of the board yielded, and on 18th November, they forced both Hill and Crow to resign. Hill's reaction was very negative, and he undertook a press campaign against what he termed the arbitrary action of the War Department in forcing his resignation. He attempted to enlist the support of several congressmen, of local businessmen, and of the National Association of Manufacturers. He made a personal visit to the War Department and issued such strong statements concerning the Army that the War Department felt impelled to issue a lengthy statement to the press defending its position. The directors went about the business of finding a new general manager to replace Hill, and within a few days had selected E.G. Coburn with the understanding that he would work unobtrusively under the direction of the War Department representative until the situation could be stabilized. It was now possible to tackle the company's labor troubles and to undertake the refinancing of the business through a new security issue. As a practical matter, solution of the labor dispute was related to this refinancing because of doubt as to the company's ability to meet the union's wage demands. Coburn undertook a series of meetings with the union, at which War Department of Labor consultant Robert F. Gaffney was present. There was considerable question as to whether Gaffney should actively participate in the discussions and what part, if any, he should play in the solution of the dispute. The decision was reached that he should remain wholly inactive and neutral, a decision that was difficult to follow because of Coburn's attempts to obtain the department's position on particular points. Coburn was generally handicapped in these negotiations by an incomplete knowledge of the company and the frequent necessity for financial consultation with his bankers. The slowness of the negotiations was such that the War Department decided on 18th December that it would withdraw from the plant by the end of the year, regardless of Coburn's progress. This decision was possible because most of Air Associates' business had been transferred elsewhere when the nation went to war. It was thought these factors might incline both parties toward concluding a labor agreement. The decision was made in spite of the fact that in the absence of such an agreement, a strike would probably follow the War Department's withdrawal. This stand had its effect. Shortly before Christmas, an agreement was reached. Termination of possession. The War Department had advised the company very early of its hope that the entire operation could eventually be concluded by the exchange of mutual releases. In addition, the War Department would assign to the company all contracts that it had made during its possession and offset against sums due the company from the government the cost of government-purchased materials in stock. Any accounts payable would be assumed by the company, and the company would be given the benefit of accounts receivable after the total cost of government operation had been deducted. The Army was prepared, if an arrangement could not be effected when it relinquished possession, to reserve the right to make a complete inventory as of the date of relinquishment and to obtain a certified balance sheet audit in order to protect itself against any claims the company might subsequently assert. The company initially appeared reluctant to accede to the proposal for mutual releases, believing it might have some claim against the government by reason of the seizure as such, but it indicated its willingness to enter into the second type of arrangement. In addition, it was prepared to fill orders, to file Social Security and unemployment insurance returns, and to preserve intact all books, records, and other data relating to the period of Army occupation. At the last moment, it agreed to the plan first suggested, and on 29 December 1941, letters of release were exchanged. That same day, after obtaining President Roosevelt's concurrence, the Army withdrew. The terms of this withdrawal were carefully set forth in special instructions from Under-Secretary Patterson to Colonel Jones that called, among other things, for a letter from the company agreeing to preserve records, to take care of Social Security, state unemployment compensation, group insurance, and hospitalization payments for employees for the period of government operation, and to advise insurers of the changed status of the company's properties. The War Department was commended by many of the company. Coburn remarked that the company would have gone into receivership if the Army had not occupied and operated the properties. Operating label problems. While the War Department was obviously obliged to dispose of day-to-day labor difficulties that arose, it did not try to correct basic conditions on the theory that their rectification was a company matter. Sweatshop conditions had existed per hour. In fact, the history of the company had been one of difficult labor relations. During the Army operation, the employees were considered government employees, and in contrast with the North American aviation case, were required to sign an application for employment when they returned to work. These applications were designed to clarify the terms and conditions of employment, but more important, were intended to obtain the employees' consent to deductions for Social Security and workmen's compensation, deductions which would have been required by law if the company had been operating the properties, but which were not required in the case of a government business. Although considered government employees, workers were not treated as such, or at least not as ordinary government employees. The terms and conditions of employment were the same as before the seizure, and it was decided that such federal laws as the 8-hour day and Saturday half-holiday laws should not be construed as applicable. In spite of War Department objections, the executive order included the same provision as in the North American Aviation Order, requiring the employment of a civilian advisor on labor relations. Considerable difficulty was experienced in obtaining such an individual because of the uncertain tenure of the job, and it was only after an exhaustive search that Robert Gaffney was finally secured. While Gaffney did an excellent job, the difficulty finding him further strengthened the War Department's desire to exclude such a provision in any future executive order. Post-termination developments. Because the agreement with the banks provided for approval by the War Department representative of all withdrawals from the special accounts, the War Department continued to have special obligations even after termination of possession. These obligations continued until the company was refinanced and the necessity for the agreement removed. War Department officials were not satisfied with the way Coburn ran the company, and Crow was brought back as president. He did a good job, and by July, all government funds had been withdrawn, and the business was on a reasonably sound financial basis in private hands. Significance of the case. The case of Air Associates, Inc. was significant because it raised a large number of basic problems that were likely to arise in any case where management refused to cooperate. It also provided an excellent opportunity for exploring and reaching tentative conclusions concerning many fiscal, procurement, inventory, accounting, and civil service problems incident to direct War Department operation. The Air Associates case clearly demonstrated the great difficulties of a seizure and showed that even in management non-compliance cases, there was a possibility of financing the operation without the use of government funds.